Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the 100 Days of Growth with me. Today we are going to be looking at another interesting topic yet in JavaScript, and we're going to be covering the if block. Some of the buggy behavior when you work with if and different JavaScript types. Let's start with strings, right? Now, a very practical example is when you work with your local storage. So let's say giving consent, maybe you try to give consent for a particular item, but because it is coming from the local storage and you forgot to pass it, it came back as a string, because whenever you store an item in the local storage, it is stored as JSON, and JSON is string. It does not see it as a JavaScript type of boolean. So whenever we run this, if given consent, this will always evaluate to has given consent, and then else CLG did not give consent. So you might be expecting did not give consent to run, but has given consent is going to run. Why? Because false is not a boolean. This false here is a string and not a boolean, so it's going to evaluate to true. So every non-empty string will evaluate to true. Note, every non-empty string, so as long as the string has value, is going to evaluate to true. So if we check this out now, you see has given what? Consent, because it is not empty. It's also the same thing when we try to use an empty string and then we give some space here. Let's even say okay, just the space, and then if we say empty string console log, so since it is empty, this should run, right? Else console log, this should not run, right? So if we check this now, okay, empty string, if the string is empty, so this should run is what is going to work. Why? Because this string is actually not empty, right? There's space in this string. This space is a value. It is considered, JavaScript sees it as a value, and if you check it here, you see this should run. Why? Because that space is there. So the right way to compare values like this, especially when comparing string, is to compare the type. It's either you compare the type or you check for the length. So for giving consent, you say if it is not equal to false, right? Notice that I use the triple check, not the double check. And then for empty string, trim off the white spaces, right? So if we do this now, you see did not give consent, this should not run. So automatically this becomes an empty string, and automatically this becomes what? False. So that's the way to handle string. Another practical example, let's comment this out, is when working with arrays or objects. So let's say we have empty array, and then we make this an empty array, and then we also have empty objects, right? And you're trying to check if empty array, because you're assuming that since it is an empty array, since the array does not have any item, it should not evaluate to true. But this is actually going to evaluate to true. This will evaluate to true, else evaluates to false, right? So but it's going to evaluate to true. So if we check this out, this will evaluate to true. Why does it behave like this? Because arrays are treated as objects, and by default objects are true whenever you run checks like this in JavaScript. So it will always evaluate to true. It's also the same thing if we check the empty object, right? It's going to evaluate to true. Now this is very, very important. Whenever you are running if checks, you need to understand that what you are trying to check here is not just the array. Instead of checking the array or the object, check the length of the array. So instead of just saying empty array, you can say empty array dot length. If we do dot length now, this is going to evaluate to false. Why? because at this point now we're no longer just checking the array, we're checking the length. You can also do the same thing also for the object, but if you want to do that for the object, you check the object keys. So you say object dot keys, and then you pass in the object and you say dot length. What this does is that it checks the length of the key. So does this object has any item inside of it? Because every object has a key and value pair. You can also check object of value, right? Depending, but object of keys is a lot more easier way to go. And then you see evaluate to false. Now another very practical example that we want to also look at is when you have if empty object dot name, right? And then you say console log this should run. Notice here now that else console log this should not run, right? Notice here now that name at this point is undefined, right? Because it does not exist, right? It is not even a value in the first place because there is no key of name. So if we check this, you see this should not run. Why did we get this should not run? Because it does not exist by default. So automatically null undefined is not. So let's even also check them. So if we say const user equal to null, we say let's user obj and then undefined, and then we say const is number, right, equal to nan, not a number. So all of this would evaluate to false by default, just like this evaluated to false. So they are undefined. Undefined will always evaluate to false. Do not forget that. So if we run if user and then we see console log user is available, else console log user is not available. So user is not available is what is going to run. And then the spelling is not correct. And then if we say if user obj, and then we say console log, then we say console log there is an object, and then we say else clg, and then we say there is no obj, and then next we say if is not a number, and then we say console log is a number, and then we say else console log is not a number. So you see now when we check here, you see user is not available, there is no object, is not a number. Why? Because all of this would always evaluate to false, right? So null would always evaluate to false. So null is to intentionally nullify a value, to say this is null. Undefined is to maybe the value in that variable was not instantiated when it was created, or maybe there was a runtime error, you missed the value, and then it is undefined. So that's the difference between null and undefined. Null is intentional. Undefined could be a runtime error, it could be a mistake, it could be maybe something happened along the line, right? It is not intentional, but either of them would always evaluate to false. So it's very important you have this in mind so that you understand this whenever you are trying to run if cases, because it is very important to understand this, else your code is going to run into bug always, and you'll be asking, why is the bug running? Another very practical example, especially when working with arrays, is when you are using a fetch. This is something that happens a lot. I see a lot of people make this mistake, and then when you are expecting users and then you say dot then, and then you see users, and then at this point you try to fetch out your response from users.json. You are stripping off your JSON and then you are converting it to JavaScript object, and then you say if response, right? So if response, so you're assuming, okay, if response, because let's assume what you're expecting from here is an array. So you're saying if response, and then you have an array here, then you see users list. This is something I see very common in a lot of with a lot of projects, it is very very buggy because, and then you say users list dot push, right? And then you push in response. Now why this is very buggy is because you might want to handle null cases or cases where your array is empty, right? So in such instances you've already missed out on, you know, what is happening. And this may not, this is the, in summary, this is just very very buggy, right? You shouldn't do this. So instead of just saying response dot um if response, you should always use dot length, right? Response dot length. No, this is not spelling of length. So I normally have issues when I'm trying to spell length, forgive me. I think I've used length today. Where is it? Okay, I've not used length, but LENGTHS. I got it. So this is the right way to go, so that you do not push empty array into another empty array. That's not necessary, right? It is pointless. Why should you be pushing an empty array into an empty array? So you should only push the response if it has value. That way it makes sense, and you know your code is very very predictable. I believe you're able to learn something. And I believe you've also, if you've been following my journey, I believe you've been able to learn one or two from when we started in day one. And I'm really excited to have you here. If you've not subscribed to my channel, do well to subscribe. You can like, you can drop a comment if you learned something, and also like the video, share it to your friends as many as possible so that they can learn one or two as well, and turn on the notification button so that you can always get notified whenever I post new video. Thank you for joining me today. See you tomorrow. Bye.